according to Luke. An expert on the law stood up to put Jesus to the test and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life?" Jesus answered, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" The lawyer replied, "You will love the Most High God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But the expert on the law, seeking self-justification, pressed Jesus further. "And just who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "There was a traveler going down from Jerusalem to Jericho who fell prey to robbers. The traveler was beaten, stripped, and left half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. The priest saw the traveler lying beside the road, but passed by on the other side. Likewise, there was a Levite who came the same way. This one too saw the afflicted traveler and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was taking the same road also came upon the traveler and, filled with compassion, approached the traveler and dressed the wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then the Samaritan put the wounded person on a donkey, went straight to an inn, and there took care of the injured one. The next day, the Samaritan took out 2 silver pieces and gave them to the innkeeper with the request, "Look after this person, and if there is any further expense, I will repay you on the way back." Which of these 3, in your opinion, was the neighbor to the traveler who fell in with the robbers? The answer came, "The one who showed compassion." Jesus replied, "Then go and do the same." The good news of salvation. You may be seated. Last week, we heard a gospel story about Jesus appointing 72 disciples. He instructed these disciples to go ahead of him to all of the places that he intended to visit and to preach the good news. Then the disciples returned with joy, reporting to Jesus that their good news was received well. Today's gospel reading comes right after last week's gospel reading in chapter 10 of the Gospel of Luke. I'd like to read the 2 verses that precede tonight's gospel in Luke chapter 10, followed by the first verse of this week's gospel, so you can see how they flow into each other. As you listen, pay attention to the transition. Then, turning to the disciples, Jesus said to them privately, "Blessed are the eyes that see what you see. For I tell you that many prophets and kings desired to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it." An expert on the law stood up to put Jesus to the test and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life?" Did you hear the transition? Because I didn't. In Luke's gospel, there are usually transitions between two different stories, like then, or after, or on one occasion, or the next day. In Luke chapter 10, there is a definite lack of transition between the passage known as the mission of the 72 disciples, which we heard last week, and the passage known as the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we heard tonight. This suggests that the text we heard tonight could have been part of the same conversation that Jesus was having with his 72 disciples. In fact, the lawyer in this story may very well have been one of these disciples. After all, the lawyer addresses Jesus as teacher before asking, "What must I do to inherit everlasting life?" Therefore, we must consider this question in the context of the disciples' joyous return from sharing the good news. I don't believe the lawyer is asking, "How do I get into heaven?" Rather, he is asking, "What is the meaning of life? How can I have the life that you talk about?" I think he is saying, "Going out there and sharing the good news felt so good. Now how can I keep this up and live my best life as your follower, Jesus?" This interpretation is reinforced by Jesus' response when he says, "Do this and you will live," not "do this and you will get into heaven." The question, "What is the meaning of life?" is an interesting question to consider, both when things are going well and when things are not going well. After a really good day, or when people in power are making decisions that I feel supported by, it is easy to answer, "How do I live my best life?" After a bad day, after getting a bad review at work, or after glancing at a social media post that makes me feel like the world is on fire, the question, "How do I live my best life?" lands very differently. The lawyer in this story knows the values that he has been taught in synagogue. When Jesus responds to the lawyer by asking, "What is written in the law, and how do you read it?" the lawyer answers by quoting Leviticus, "You must love God and your neighbor as yourself." The lawyer then presses further, asking, "And just who is my neighbor?" This question is the crux of the whole rest of the story. He is asking, if I want to live, and I mean really live, then who do I need to love? Jesus replies with a story about compassion. For some of you, tonight may be the first time you have ever heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, as it is told in the Gospel according to Luke. For those of you who have heard it before, I'd like you to take a step back and pretend that this is your first time hearing it as well. Because of the significance of this story in our culture, when we hear the word Samaritan, we automatically associate it with good. However, for the disciples that Jesus is speaking to, and for the audience of Luke's gospel, the Samaritans were a despised group of people because they practiced a religion that was similar to first century mainstream Judaism, but also different in key ways. The Samaritans worshipped the same God as the Jews, but only accepted the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as their holy text. They also worshipped a different temple on a different mountain. They rejected the temple on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, which is where Jesus and the Jews from Judah worshipped. These differences in religious practice were due to a long history of political warfare and separation between the neighboring kingdoms of Judah, where Jerusalem was, and Israel, where Samaria was. For this reason, the Jews and the Samaritans harbored a mutual hatred for one another. Luke smartly sets this context for his audience when, just one chapter before the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus enters a village of Samaritans and they refuse to welcome him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. That comes from Luke chapter 9, verse 53. For Jesus' disciples and Luke's original audience, the Samaritans were the bad guys. On the other hand, the priest and the Levite from tonight's parable were characters who first-century Jews would have looked up to. The priest was a religious leader whose actions were guided by faith and Jewish values. The Levites were descendants of Jacob, who, according to Jesus' followers, practiced the right kind of Judaism. Yet, when the priest in Jesus' story was walking down the street and saw a battered, half-dead traveler on the side of the road, he passed by on the other side. The Levite who walked by next did the same thing. I don't know about you, but when I hear the phrase, passed by on the other side, I picture both the priest and the Levite crossing the street in order to get farther away from the wounded man. They are not just ignoring him, they are actively avoiding him. Why? Just for a moment, I'd like you to imagine walking down a street here in the West Village, or perhaps near your home for those of you on Zoom, and seeing someone who is just beaten up by a gang. Would you cross to the other side of the street? If so, why? I can think of 3 reasons why I actively avoid both strangers and acquaintances in my life: fear, disgust, and hatred. When I feel afraid of someone or something, I try to get as far away as possible. When I am disgusted by someone or something, I unconsciously move to create more space between me and what I find disgusting. When I feel anger or hatred towards someone, I try to minimize my interactions with them as much as possible. All of these actions amount to actively avoiding the people that I hate, the people that I am afraid of, and the people that I am disgusted by. Jesus tells this story to help the lawyer understand what he must do to inherit everlasting life. I want everlasting life, not just when I die, but now. If the way to do that is to show compassion toward the people I fear, hate, and am disgusted by, then I want to figure out how to do that. I want to learn how to respond differently when I encounter the person who I am afraid has the power to hurt me, the coworker, friend, or spouse who I am angry with, and the subway rider sitting next to me who just vomited on the floor and is really grossing me out. As I was reflecting on my life and my experiences of avoidance in preparation for tonight's homily, I found 3 steps that help me respond differently. The first step is for me to recognize the humanity in the other person. When this feels particularly hard, I recall a time that I felt feared, hated, or perceived as disgusting. As a member of this LGBTQIA Catholic community, I need only dig a little bit into my own history and the history of my queer ancestors to recall this feeling. Then, from that memory, I can recognize that no one deserves to feel feared, hated, or perceived as disgusting. I can see the humanity of the person in front of me and remember that, no matter what, I want to respect their human dignity. The second step is to look for my share in the responsibility. Fred Rogers, the late host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, spent a lot of time thinking about what neighborliness meant and how to communicate that to children. He said, "We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, not my community, it's not my world, and it's not my problem." Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. If I want the world to be different, then I need to make it so. It is not going to happen if I don't participate. Now, this does not mean that I am responsible for other people's actions. I still want to have healthy human boundaries. But it does mean that my realm of responsibility extends beyond the 1-foot radius of my life and my home. I have a share in the responsibility for my community, for my city, for my country, and for my world. If I choose to look away from the mass deportations happening right now, then I am in part responsible. Looking for my share of responsibility, especially when I am upset, helps motivate and inspire me to respond differently to the people that I want to avoid. The third step is looking for role models. One of Mr. Rogers' most memorable stories is, when I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news. My mother would say to me, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." Change is not easy. Neither is showing love and compassion toward the people I dislike. But looking for the good around me helps me see that it is possible. Looking for people who are showing love and compassion in times of hatred and fear helps me learn what compassion looks like and how I can offer it too. Jesus didn't expect his followers to inherit everlasting life alone. He expected them to work together to build God's kingdom on earth. So should we. The last thing I'd like to say is that showing compassion doesn't just look like caring for a battered victim. It also looks like questioning why this man was robbed and beaten at this particular location and at this particular time, and working to prevent these attacks from happening in the first place. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." With the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus taught his followers that true compassion takes many forms. It looks like caring for the wounded stranger by dressing his wounds and by effecting structural change to prevent others from being wounded in the future. If Jesus wasn't also trying to make a point about hatred and prejudice, then he wouldn't have made his religious rival the hero of this story. If I want to live my best Catholic life, I might try doing one or all of these things, especially when it feels like the world is on fire.